My Uncle Silas had a small rough paddock with a bramble cowshed at one corner, with 2 or 3 acres behind it for corn and potatoes, and one Boxing Day he said to Sammy Twiggle, "Sammy, son boy, there's a couple of pheasants as big as turkeys roosting that ash again my hovel. Come on New Year's Eve and we'll get the gun. Make a party of it." Sammy was a retired house painter, and he stood about 6 feet, with arms as long as a monkey's and a face like a laying hen. His nose was bulbous. My Uncle Silas was no beauty either, with one eye bloodshot, and his way of looking cockeyed and satanic at the same time. But he could see all right, and so could Sammy. From the tops of ladders, they would say, you got a funny view of the world. So Sammy came snooping in at Silas's door, like a beery giraffe, about 1 o'clock on the afternoon of the New Year's Eve. And Silas said, "Oh, you sit down, Sammy. Let's have a wet before we start. Malt a little wine. Cut a cowslip." He filled 2 tumblers with wine, and then, as they were drinking, he looked hard at Sammy in wonder. "What are the Hanovers that on top of your head, Sammy?" he said. "That," Sammy said, that's a shooting hat. It was a big loose green felt with a fancy feather in it." "Shooting hat? Looks more like a pair of old ladies' handbags dyed green. Shooting hat? Where'd you get it?" "You gotta wear a proper hat for shooting," Sammy said. "Any fool knows that. This hat belonged to Lord William. It's a real shooting hat." "Is it?" Silas said. "Well, I'll lay you a brace of pheasants to a trouser button it ain't. So there. And I'll tell you why it is. It's a fishing hat. The pheasants will think you're a blamed old turkey or something. A proper shooting hat's a deer stalker. Looks like Noah's Ark on your head, only upside down. I'll show you. I got one." So Silas went upstairs and came down with a check deer stalker on his head, and Sammy nearly had a fit. That's a pike fishing hat," he said. "You undo the flaps, and you can sit then all day, and your ears don't get cold." "Sammy," Silas said, "a gent was killed in this hat, shot at, and stole for a pigeon. That'll show you whether it's a shooting hat or not. Look," he said. "You see them 2 little holes this side? Well, that's where the bullets went in. And you see them 2 little holes that side? Well, that's where they came out. Drop more wine." Silas filled up the tumblers, and Sammy, defeated, drank. "You got the gun loaded?" he said. "I've been loading it all morning," Silas said. The gun was a muzzle loader, about 50 years old, and it was the reason for Sammy and my Uncle Silas coming together. The gun had once belonged to Sammy, and my Uncle Silas had bought it from him for 15 shillings and a young pig on one condition. And the condition was that Sammy should come and shoot it once a year. It was a good gun, except for one thing. There were times when it would not go off. The trigger would jam, and nothing on earth would move it. Finally, just as you had given it up as a bad job, it suddenly went off and blew the roof out or killed a cow or something. Otherwise, a fine gun. Silas always loaded it with powder and shot and old newspapers and rusty nails and old rat's nest and hairpins and dried mice and brace buttons, and in fact almost anything lying about, and when it did go off it made a considerable impression. "Yes, I got him loaded," Silas said, "but we can wait a minute. They don't begin to roost until about 3 o'clock. And by gosh, Sammy, they're as fat as butter. They're as big as turkeys. I've been laying corn down for 'em for over a fortnight. You could catch 'em with your hands." "Cocks," Sammy said. "Cocks? I tell you they're as big as turkeys." After that they sat still, Silas filling and refilling the glasses for a long time. It was a cold afternoon, with a light piebald fall of snow on the fields, and the air dead still and frozen. By the time they were on their 4th bottle, it was 3 o'clock, and Sammy said, "If we don't get started, we shan't see whether the cocks are hens or bushel baskets."
"Sammy," Silas said, "them pheasants are so tame you could catch 'em in mouse traps. It'll be kids' play. What's wrong with sitting here? Ain't we all right? Another mouthful of wine?"
So they sat for another half hour, and the feeling of twilight, snow wild, was already growing strong, when finally Silas got up and staggered into the kitchen for the gun and the powder horn and the ramrod and the bag of rusty nails and brace buttons and old sweepings for the reload.
"You carry the bag and the shot, Sammy," he said, "and I'll carry the gun. And you put your hat straight."
Very offended, Sammy staggered up, with his hat cocked on the back of his head, looking like a cross between a bishop's mitre and a pair of horse's ear bags.
"That's as straight as I am," he bawled. "Look at that blamed stag starter on yourn. Terrible."
"Deer starter," Silas shouted.
"Not stag starter. Anyway, it's better than wearing the old woman's trousers. Pipe down. Let's get on." "Shame to leave that drop in the bottle," Sammy said. "Ain't it?" "Oh, it is, Sammy, it is. Put it in your pocket. Take it with us."
So Sammy put the wine bottle in his poacher's pocket, and, carrying gun and bags and bottle, they staggered down the garden, over the fence, and across the field. In the light snow, the tracks made a kind of crazy chain, linking up and staggering away, so that Silas bawled at last, "What's the use of me walking straight if you don't? Pull your hat out your eyes, man. How do you expect to see straight?" "Who can't see straight? Eh? Who can't see straight? I'm all right. Where are them pheasants? That's what I want to know." "Sorry, boy," my Uncle Silas said. "In a minute, all in good time." "Whoa, stand still. You see that oval?" "Which one?" "That one. There's only one." "You're a liar. There's two." "All right, Sammy, there's two. Now you walk over, and behind that oval you'll see 'em sitting on the grass waiting for you. Two cocks eating corn. All you gotta do is beat 'em up, and I'll have 'em down before you can wink." "All right," Sammy said. "Only for God's sake take that blamed stag starter off, else they'll be afraid at you." "Deer starter," Silas shouted. Sammy made snake tracks in the snow. Silas moved after him with dreamy caution. Twilight was deepening, with a savage orange light on the horizon beyond the hovel. Suddenly Sammy set up a great shout, and the pheasants came over towards my Uncle Silas on fast dark wings. Silas took aim, the gun wavering about as though held by a man with St. Vitus' dance, and then shot. The kick of the muzzle loader knocked him instantaneously flat on his back, and the pheasants veered and swooped and screeched away beyond the house and the spinney, and were lost to sight. "You beat 'em too sharp," Silas bawled. "Too sharp be damned," Sammy shouted. "That blamed stag starter fret 'em to death." They stood in the snow, holding each other up, and had a slightly offended altercation. It was growing darker. They had a drink. After the shot and the screech of pheasants, the day was dead silent, and after the drink they began suddenly to speak in low voices, as though afraid of being heard. "Sammy, listen to me. You get over the other side of that edge and go round by Acart's barn and see if you can beat some up when I get loaded again. There's pheasants running about there like hens. I'll stand under the edge so nobody'll see me. We'll have a couple down in a pub." It was almost dark when Sammy climbed the fence, and to Silas, standing under the hedge, the clouds looked like tawny elephants. He stood there for a long time, but nothing happened, and then finally he heard Sammy's voice in a whisper. "Ain't you seen it?" "Seen what?" "That pheasant I beat up as big as a turkey. It wore through." "What? By golly, I ain't seen a thing." "Wait a minute, I'll whistle when it's up." In a moment Silas heard a faint whistle, like the air escaping from the hole in a barrel, but he could see no bird. He waited, and then Sammy called in a whisper, "Why don't you shoot?" "I ain't seen nothing."
Then take that stag's daughter off and look. He's sitting on the fence by the oval. Pip him."
Silas looked.
"By gum," he said. "By gum, if that ain't the biggest pheasant I ever see. Shoot, man. Shoot before the blame hat scares it. Shut up, women's breeches, and let me get aim."
In the half-darkness, Silas took a long, slow and steady aim at the colossal silhouette of the bird on the fence, and then pulled the trigger. Nothing happened, no sound, and the bird still sat there. In a great sweat of trouble, Silas cocked again, took aim, and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. To Silas the world went round. The great elephant cloud swam tipsily, and still that colossal myth of a bird sat on the fence. Then he cocked a third time, and took aim, and pulled again, but the gun was dumb.
"Sammy!" he called. "Sammy boy, she's stuck! Quick, Sam boy! Sammy!"
Sammy fell over the fence, and when he got up again, they struggled feverishly in a sweat of despair to ease the trigger off. But it was no good. It was as though the thing had frozen. And finally Sammy said, "It's no use. I'll catch it with me hands. You stop here while I creep up and drop on it. If he gets up and you can fire, then fire like blazes." Sammy made tracks in the snow and finally went behind the hovel, and from that moment my Uncle Silas lost him. All the time he stood trying to ease the gun off, but it was no go. Then suddenly he looked at the fence, and he could see not one bird, but a brace. Two vast shapes huddled like roosting turkeys. He began to stagger towards them, stumbling like a man who had seen a vision. It was a sportsman's nightmare to see, not 30 yards off, a brace of the biggest, and to have, at the same time, a gun that wouldn't go off. And finally he could bear it no longer. He stopped, took an aim in which the barrel wobbled like a jelly, and then touched the trigger. The gun went off immediately and knocked him flat on his back. It always did that. He expected it, and he was not surprised. What did surprise him was the sound of moaning. It came from beyond the fence. My Uncle Silas struggled up, rolled across the field like a sailor on the deck of a storm-tossed ship, and found Sammy lying in the ditch with no hat on and a 15-pound turkey dead on his chest.
"You killed me," Sammy said. "You blowed my hat to bits." "Good God, is there turkey?"
Silas said.
"I'm shot," Sammy said. "You shot my hat off. I'm done." "There was another one, a brace," Silas said. "For God's sake," Sammy said. "Blood's running down my chest. For God's sake, if the last thing you do, get me up."
So Silas picked up the turkey with one hand and got Sammy up with the other. And it turned out, after a time, that it was not blood running down his chest, but wine. Then it seemed that Sammy could stand up, that he could walk about, and finally that it was not he that was shattered at all, but his hat.
"We gotta find it," he kept saying. "We gotta find it."
And at last they did find it, in the next field, in a patch of kale.
"By gum, there's some air holes in it," Silas said. "The old lady'll feel a draught, won't she?"
And the idea was so good that he laughed so much that Sammy wanted to fight him, there and then, in the darkness and the snow. But 2 days after New Year's Day, he laughed the other side of his face. Sammy's old lady came up then, and gave him a couple of cracks with a copper stick that he felt for a month. For it appears, after all, that she did wear that hat. But my Uncle Silas, in revenge, would never have it at all, that it was on her head.